All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this lovely Friday afternoon. We're broadcasting live from Circl, the Circular platform, right here in Amsterdam. My name is Egidio Bundel, and I will be your host for today. It's a pleasure to be standing here right in front of you. It's beautiful weather outside, lovely weather, but you took the time to be here with us. So thank you for that, and also thank you for the moments that you will experience with us today. As I mentioned before, today is a beautiful day, not only because it's a sunny weather, but because we will touch upon an extremely interesting topic for today. And we also have a special guest that will talk us through that. Pretty much everything that we do at ABN AMRO revolves around our purpose, banking for better for generations to come. Think of our daily work, think of the processes that we design, but also the decisions that we are making are in service of the next generations. To safeguard pretty much a livable planet for not only us, but for the next generations. But how do we help shape an economy that creates a broad welfare for the current and the next future generations? We will discuss this together with our guest of today. His name is Werner Schouten. He's only 23 years old, former president of the Youth Climate Movement. He's also a radio host of the show BNR Frontrunners. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me give a warm applause to Werner Schouten. Thanks for being here, Werner.
Thank you for the introduction and for having me.
Definitely good to see you.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious. For me, it's the first time seeing you in person. Where were you born? How did you get started with sustainability?
Well, I was born in the north of Holland, and then I wasn't really into touch with sustainability, actually. It was just like, I was very competitive though, but other than that, I wasn't really focusing on sustainability. And at the moment I got in touch with sustainability was actually when I was at a summer school in South Korea. I know it's not very sustainable to go there. Actually, I had some slides also for that. Like, I was at this university. It's like for a month, I did like a summer school at South Korea. And as you can see, the university was beautiful. It was very modern. But 2 steps out of that university, I came into a completely different reality. The reality of like a lower class Koreans, like narrow streets, electricity cables running above your head, and many people living on the streets. Mm-hmm. And it was this neighborhood that I walked through like every single day towards that university from my apartment. And you have to imagine summer, South Korea, Seoul, when the wind is coming from the wrong direction, it's very warm, and then all the nano dust and smog and greenhouse gases come from China and then sort of cover up the city. So I then already walked with mouth masks, and while I was walking with a mouth mask from my apartment to the university, every single day I came across this old lady. She was 70, 80 years old, always with such a pickup thing with like to sell cardboard as an addition to her retirement, and I never saw her wearing protection, while I was always wearing protection.
Did you bring her a mouthpiece?
No, that's actually I've never been asked that, actually.
Okay.
That's a very good point. Yeah, like I also didn't speak any Korean, in all honesty, but then I was like, when I saw that, I was like, well, I could at least sort of also retract in like well-ventilated buildings for most of the day. She was most of the day in the street. And I was like, with my flight to Korea, maybe even contributed more than greenhouse gases and environmental pollution than she ever did in her working career. Well, she is facing the worst consequences from it. And that just sort of didn't tick. That just couldn't come together. And that sort of brought me into sustainability and trying to strive for a more sustainable 2100.
Okay, sounds interesting. And what or who inspired you to do what you're currently doing today? If there is someone that inspired you.
No, I'd say this experience, like you,
okay.
Of course, I think we all have these, we see it on the news, for example, but we don't let those numbers mean anything or feel. And once you feel it on the level of your heart, then it's sort of like, it became for me like the umbrella on which I base my career.
All right, I won't keep the audience waiting.
Yeah.
The floor is yours, Werner.
Thanks so much. Yeah. So this is a nice bridge to sort of the youth climate movement, because when I came back into the Netherlands after my summer school, I was like, I had to do something. And then I saw these climate strikes on the Malieveld and in Amsterdam. I was like, that's good, but if you want to influence if you want to influence policy, then you should also be at the place where policy is made. And that's what the youth climate movement did. We unite the voice of about 100,000 youngsters in climate policies, and then we sit at a table of, for example, the climate agreement, the formation of the new government agreement, the circular economy policies, and such. And I've been the chair of that for like 2 years. And I think that with the youth climate movement, we did something actually rather unique in this day and age, which is that we united over 100,000 youngsters that are part of a generation that doesn't want to be united anymore. They're not part of churches anymore. They're not part of labor unions anymore, not part of associations. Like self-help books are getting a boom because we're so much focused on our own career or our own success, etc. But we managed to unite them, and we did that actually in a rather innovative way. It was not my idea, but we developed this youth climate agenda, a vision for 2050 on how we want to work, live, eat, travel, and learn in 2050. It was sort of like a blueprint, a vision. And with such a future positive vision, people connect to it. And while continuously developing it and talking with the people, like how should it work, we sort of increased sort of our community. And then what my role was to actually translate that far vision from 2050 back to what kind of policies we need today and tomorrow to actually make those steps. And that's a rather unique positioning, because at the climate agreement, what I saw was mostly companies that were like, okay, like we exist and we want to exist in 10 years. So let's just try to make changes, but not too radical, because that harms our revenue model. So that's a completely different sort of starting position. And actually, if you want to make change within an organization, it's very advisable to also, with like a coalition of the willing, develop such a shared vision, because it sort of gives the perspective that change is possible, and it gives the perspective of how, for example, ABN AMRO can take up a different role in society. So we use this youth climate agenda on a lot of places. We discussed with Minister Rutte on the Katshuis, as you can see on the left upper picture, or right upper picture for you. So that was rather useful. And when I started at the youth climate movement, I slowly got into sort of climate information. And to just give you a grasp, I quickly sort of felt the urgency. To give you an idea, by 2020, we only had like 8% of our carbon budget left, which means that if we continue emitting carbon as we do now, by 2027, we've emitted more than what we're actually allowed to stay under the 1.5 degrees. So we all talk about 2030 and 2050. It's actually about today and tomorrow. This presentation was given by the IPCC on the climate summit in Glasgow. If we want to have a 2/3 chance of staying well below 2 degrees, actually 1.5, then what we need to do is we need to reduce emissions every single year from now on by 10%. In 2022, 2023, 2024, that's a big challenge. And FYI, that's our responsibility. I think we, the richest 10% of the people on this planet, to which I think we here all belong, emit as much as the other 6.7 billion people combined. Like if we all were to live like we are doing in the Netherlands, we would need 3 planets of earth, metals, forests, etc. So that is sort of like the context of how I got into it. But I was rather optimistic when I started as a chair of the youth climate movement, because I figured, like, I saw all these organizations making climate commitments. I saw, for example, ABN AMRO with a very nice strategy of banking for better for generations to come. So I was like, hey, we're on the radar. We're taken into account. But then I actually delved into the actual practices, and what I see in business now is actually much more a bit like this. It's like, while we're faced with a severe crisis, we're still sort of finishing our last hole of golf before we may think, okay, maybe we should leave for the coming forest fire. This is, for me, like very symbolic to how we now act. And then you may think, okay, nice Photoshop, Werner, but this is actually true. This is Oregon 2017, United States. Because we're faced with an enormous crisis, the climate crisis. But the odd thing is, there's a complete lack of sort of crisis awareness, because what would you do if you're in a crisis? You unite all your innovation power, all your talent, all your money to sort of battle this crisis. This is exactly what we've seen with the COVID crisis, right? But the other thing is, if we see our response to the climate crisis, we, on a big scale, sort of waste innovation power, talents, money in our society to innovations that rarely contribute to societal challenges, if not only this climate crisis. To give you a few examples, we see, for example, the rise of the billions that are put into these grocery delivery services that deliver your groceries within 10 minutes in a city. I myself live in Rotterdam. I have, at a distance of 3 kilometers to my house, 40 groceries. So it has no added societal value. It's just ease that has sort of driven this, but billions are poured into it, hundreds of people working for it. The same for example, space tourism that started last summer of Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. The brightest sort of students from spatial engineering and such start working for these companies, for mostly sort of the upper echelon of the people to actually facilitate space tourism, but not a clear societal value. And we can go on and on. There are like very clear examples. I've added a picture of Chile. That's a desert where sort of dumped clothing is sort of placed that pollutes the groundwater, because where initially fashion organizations had like 2 collections every year, Primark, H&M are now doing 16 collections every year, and they dump everything that's just not sold. And these are like the clear things. These are like the clearly sort of like wrong things. But if you think about it further, isn't it odd that, like, faced with big societal challenges, whether it's now biodiversity, inequality, or climate, that we have the brightest IT students that go to Facebook to optimize like buttons. We have the brightest econometrists that work for flow traders to do this like hyper trading. I was at Avico, maybe you know it from like the potatoes and those things. They have a whole food lab of like with a dozen of food scientists to make your potato fry more crunchy. Like we fall into abyss, but with crunchy fries. Now, it's no wonder that 38% of Dutch people that are actually employed say that they have a bullshit job. A job of which they themselves feel that they have no clear societal value. So that's the thing that we have to address. And then du moment that we do work on sustainability, we mostly work on like these far goals from 2030, 2050. It's always an add-on to actually the business model, but never the core. And it's rather problematic because the IPCC warns us that if we want to stay under this 1.5 degrees, we have to fundamentally restructure production and consumption in society. But what we do now, if you look at the climate agreement, it's predominantly focused as, okay, we have our current production and consumption. We don't gonna touch that, but let's just make that all emissionless. We have like all the sectors, industries, and companies that we have now. We just try to do exactly that, but then just halve the emissions by 2030, ranging from without questioning whether a specific sector has to be there in a climate neutral society, ranging from the swap feeds that breaks down in a month to the luxurious yachts of Damen shipyards, from the crap that we import from AliExpress to the data centers of Facebook, everything we put in this emissionless jacket. So that is the challenge that we're up for. Is that sustainability? If at all taken into consideration, it is too often still a door on the second floor of a business and not into the core operating model. And that brings me to my core message of this afternoon. And I think it's also sort of a red line that has gone through this whole learning week regarding sustainability at ABN AMRO, is that we need a gene therapy for the economy. We need to work on an economy in which work, innovation, and entrepreneurship doesn't only lead to financial capital, but it leads to broad wealth. And with broad wealth, I don't only mean financial capital, I mean the combination of financial, social, human, intellectual, produced, and natural capital combined. And not only for the current generations, but also for the generations in 2100. That is, in my opinion, what we need to do for our society. And if you take this lens and look at the economy, as you probably may have guessed also from my earlier story, we're not that good yet at creating broad wealth. Like, we always focus on efficiency, but that is financial efficiency. But if you look at sort of GDP growth against like broad wealth growth, which I did in this graph, you see were not that effective. Like what I brought here is like an indexation of like GDP growth, which is the orange line, against the broad wealth growth. It's a broad wealth indicator. So that's a combination of how happy we feel, our health, how healthy we are, how healthy our planet is. It's a combination of all of these capitals. And what you see is rather interesting is that like around in the 18th century, growth of the economy actually went well along with growth in our experienced broad wealth. Then you see a big dip, of course, around 40, 45, the Second World War. And then after that, something very particular happens. Because then the economy grew, since the 1950s, grew 4 times faster than the experienced broad wealth in the Netherlands. So while we sort of broke through all our planetary boundaries, etc., started to pollute much more than actually was allowed, our broad wealth didn't really come along as much as we, as much as you'd say from sort of, as much as sort of the GDP grew. And this, the factor then also sort of excluded, for example, the broad wealth that we perhaps destroyed in other parts of the world. So, for example, the rainforest that had to fall for the soy that we use in our country, the people that are still in forced labor. 1 in 200 employees, actually 40 million people still in forced labor. That's not included in this broad wealth indicator. So if you look at this, I wouldn't call our economy very efficient. It's not very effective at creating broad wealth. It's very effective at creating financial capital. So that's the key that we have to change. Now you may wonder, okay, how are we then going to change our economy so that we maximize broad wealth? We have to do sort of the similar thing as we did with financial capital. It took us 300 years to develop the accounting system that we now have to sort of measure, report, and actually steer on financial capital. And we have to accelerate that process to do it for all those other capitals as well. We have to sort of not only, we have to steer not only on financial capital, but on broad wealth. That is sort of our goal. We have to make those non-financial numbers as hard as those financial numbers so that you can create incentives for it. Then, for example, if we all know like the broad wealth of the top organizations in the Netherlands, you can give tax cuts to the better performing organizations. You can, as an ABN AMRO, for example, start to exclude specific companies that are very low on creating broad wealth or maybe net value destroying. Governments can, for example, give more subsidies to companies that create broad wealth. So once we get the grips of actually measuring this, we can also start steering on it. And believe me, then you get like wholly different innovation as well, because then all of a sudden, if we start measuring broad wealth, it doesn't reward you anymore to develop a revenue model which has as goal to just push as many products into the economy. It has value then to resolve societal issues, to, for example, develop an innovation that helps like us with our mental health, develop an innovation that helps us regain trust in society or trust in democracy. It is then, for example, completely foolish to not build like neighborhoods without green stuff, because we know from a broad wealth perspective that like if we add like a nature into neighborhoods, 15% lower obesity rate among young kids. You have people that are much happier, you have spontaneous interactions, and you have biodiversity that flourishes. It's a climate it's good for climate adaptation. So like we need to take this much broader look at value and at what we need to innovate. And a nice example, for example, is also car ownership. While car ownership, I think most of us have a car. If you look at broad wealth, at a broad wealth perspective on this, you may wonder whether like car ownership is the most effective thing, even if it's like an electric car, because it takes up a lot of space in the city. It requires a very strong electricity net to charge all those cars if they are all electric. It requires a lot of scarce, rare earth metals to actually sort of fill up these batteries with. From a broad wealth perspective, it makes much more sense to actually reduce car ownership and let shared electric cars, public transport, for example, flourish, so that you can use space in the city, space on the electricity net for many different things. So this view on this different view on broad wealth, on what value is in society and what we define as progress, strongly influences then also how we innovate. But the key thing is, of course, that it has to count in the market. And then you may, of course, wonder, like, okay, Werner, nice vision, keep on dreaming. But the first this turnaround is already happening. For 2 years, I've been the chair of the Youth Climate Movement, and one of the key things that we achieved was a generation test in our government agreement. So for every new set of climate policies, it has to be tested. What does that for like the well-being, the broad wealth of generations in 2050 and 2070? So the government is already taking this up. Another nice example is what I brought you here. This building is developed by Ballast Nedam Development. It's called Horizons in Amsterdam. It was completely designed on the basis of maximizing this broad wealth. So it is a completely wooden structure. That's a net carbon sink. It's producing more electricity than it's actually using. It consists of a lot of biodiversity. It consists of a lot of shared spaces so that sort of community is supported, of the sort of truly a living community is created within the building. So there are already a lot of companies actually taking action on it as well. And the Netherlands is also not the only one taking action. A nice example is, for example, the government of New Zealand. The government of New Zealand has a well-being budget. Every expenditure, every government project has to have a proof of contribution to broad wealth. So like financial capital is not the leading decision maker for that government anymore. So we're seeing this turnaround coming about in society. And you may think, okay, these are then sort of the frontiers. My radio show that I host is also BNR Koplopers. It's about the pioneers in sustainability. But the fun thing is, also the backmarkers are now facing increasingly sort of the discussion of what we see as value. A nice example recently was currently have the discussion about Circl, whether it should become bigger, whether it should be accommodated to have more flights, or whether it should actually shrink. And then the gemeente, the municipality of Aalsmeer, actually demanded this societal cost and benefit analysis of expanding or shrinking Schiphol. And as it turned out, shrinking Schiphol, reducing the number of flights, actually led to a net societal benefit of like 6.5 billion euros for the overall of the Netherlands. And if you reduce the flights from like 500,000 to 375,000 flights. So like this perspective is also, the backmarkers are also confronted with this changing perspective on what we define as value in society. So it's becoming increasingly clear. And a nice example of this, final example, is, for example, Eneco. Eneco was taken over a few years ago by Mitsubishi, but in that sort of merger, then also Shell was willing to actually take over Eneco. What Shell did as a mistake is they did a sole financial analysis on like what Eneco was worth. They just looked at the assets and such, and they came to a valuation of around 3 billion euros, I think. But they actually big time lost the bid from Mitsubishi, because Mitsubishi looked at this broad wealth perspective, at the transition possibility of Eneco in this energy transition, and came to a 25% higher bid and actually won the bidding. And the fun thing is, shortly afterwards, Shell was sued by Milieudefensie, and I think that they now wish they would have acquired Eneco, because that would have given them much more steps forward already in reducing their carbon emissions. So sometimes it also just makes business sense to look at this broad wealth to ensure the continuity of your business. And a final example also, like the DNB, we of course see the green taxonomy, CSRD, increasingly we need to take into account these non-financial metrics also for banks, of course, and this is only the tip of the iceberg. The DNB is already sort of working also on more and more reports on biodiversity, quantifying that, and is only waiting until we see social capital, human capital, also getting strong numbers. Now, you may, of course, wonder, okay, this is my pitch for the broad wealth economy, in which we create broad wealth not only for current generations, but also for generations in 2050. Now, you may, of course, wonder, like, what does this mean for us as ABN AMRO, as bank? And for that, I actually have to kick off with a compliment, because you guys already report on impact. I have shown the front page of the impact report of 2021. You already sort of report the value on all those 6 capitals that I just listed. So it's pretty good. Though when I read the report, it's still mostly backward looking, as in like it's like looking in the mirror of a car. Like it doesn't provide the basis yet for decision making. So that would be the next step, to actually integrate this 6 capitals into your risk models, into your valuation models, into your decision making, so that you can actually start steering on it, to integrate it, for example, social and sustainable dimensions into your risk profiles, because hopefully they then get better risk profiles, because like they're less vulnerable to like newer technologies or regulations that come up for sustainability. So that would be the next step. And then, of course, once you integrate that into actually the decision making, it's important to of course, create also like incentives. Maybe give an impact discount to sort of, or like a lower discount, lower interest rate for the organizations that create a better, broad wealth, so that you help your companies, incentivize your companies to actually also maximize the societal value. Now, that would be, of course, the first step. But you can't sort of get away to look at and evaluate your client portfolio with it. Because, yeah, as a matter of fact, a lot of companies are netto, just like net value destroying in the, currently, if you take this broad wealth perspective. So then, actually, you should, looking at your portfolio, should take these broad wealth dimensions and actually maybe develop stricter criteria on them, whether you should accept them as your client. Because that is, in the end, in my opinion, then you come closer to sort of the core of what a bank ought to do. Because a bank ought to do is to finance what society needs. That doesn't mean anything goes. That doesn't mean that any company that comes by, you should try to finance. It should be about the allocation of like the scarce resources, talent, time, capacity that we have in the most productive way to create welfare. A bank should finance what society needs. And that then also means that you might want to exclude over time value-destroying companies. You already do that with tobacco, you do it with weapons, you do it with fossil fuels, I've been told. But I can imagine that you want to do that broader. For example, KLM at this day and age is not value creating. Fast fashion companies are not value creating. And you don't overnight have to kick those out of your portfolio, but at least set goals together on when and agree on when they will be value creating. And if they aren't, maybe you should be strict to them. Because the thing is, we have only scarce resources. We only have scarce talent, we only have scarce money, and we need every single euro, every single hour of talented persons for this transition. According to the International Energy Agency, we need 3 times as high investment in renewable energy. So any euro that doesn't go to KLM can go to a more sustainable alternative, to Lightyear that creates like radically innovative and sustainable cars, to Mosa meat that creates lab-grown meat, to those vegan cowboys which replaces cows with like iron cows, which are machines in which you put in grass and you get out milk practically. You get out the milk protein. So that is the innovation that we need. And then as a result, you exclude value-destroying activities. And of course, you can't do this alone, but since you as ABN AMRO are already sort of leading with your impact report, I'd say use this as your competitive advantage. I mean, like, you guys are already starting it on measuring it. Try to lobby for that this becomes a standard, because then you're well ahead, I'd say. Yeah. And then the last step is actually, if you want to change an organization, it's always key that you look at 3 things. It's culture, structure, and practice. The structure we've been talking about, the rules that you have to play by, but the culture is also important. The culture that lives within the bank about what we define as value together. And then it helps, for example, to start reward people with, I don't know your exact bonus culture, but to reward people based on broad wealth. If they are performing well on the KPIs based on broad wealth, give them a higher salary or reward them in some other way, but then so that a culture starts to live based on broad wealth and on increasing welfare productivity on all departments of the bank. So that would be my suggestions for banking for broad wealth. Now, when I propose these things, it's like sort of a crisis approach to make sure that we stay within these 1.5 degrees, 1.5 degree society. What I often get back from board members, from everyone, from a lot of people, maybe you recognize this argument as well, is that people say like, yeah, but we already do everything in our power to accelerate this energy transition. And I want to kill off that argument right here, right now, because that's simply not the case. We barely know what all is possible to accelerate this transition, because once we see something, and I think we should with the climate crisis, once you see something truly as a crisis, you expand the boundaries of what actually is feasible and possible within your department. Because that's exactly what we've seen with the COVID crisis. In the COVID crisis, we've seen budget rules that the government didn't use anymore. We've seen tens of billions of euros investment in the economy. We've seen supply chain of mouth masks that was set up in no time. We've seen the development time of a vaccine reduced from multiple years to just a few months. And these points, all of them were just like considered impossible before the crisis, until it was done. And that's not just only the COVID crisis, it's any crisis. It's like a pattern. If you see now the gas crisis, all of a sudden it's possible to reduce our dependency on Russian gas by 2/3 in 1 year in the EU. All of a sudden it's possible to import within a few months liquefied natural gas through the Groningen seaport. Is unthinkable outside of crisis situation. Same with the nitrogen crisis. All of a sudden we saw popping up construction sites that were fully nitrogen free when the nitrogen crisis occurs. So there's much more possibilities once you try to see it. So what I try to tell you here is that like this transition towards broad wealth is what we need for that is that we are still crafting the rule book for this 1.5 degree society. We need to test all our behaviors, all our revenue models, all our risk models, all our routines and arguments to check whether it's aligned with this 1.5 degrees. And if it's not, you got to throw it out of the window and change the rules by which you play. If you, for example, as a relationship manager, have a very good like sustainability entrepreneur, for example, but the project just doesn't get to a risk assessment, question every step of the way in that risk assessment to see whether all the transition risks or transition opportunities are properly factored in. You got to go the full 200% for this new economy that we have to build up. And what you then see is that if you look long enough to cases, to business models, you will see the opportunities for change. A nice concrete example. I myself live in Rotterdam, in the neighborhood of Delfshaven. And across from the street is another neighborhood called Bospolder Tussendijk, and it's one of the poorest neighborhoods in the Netherlands. And the woningcorporatie, the housing corporation, Havenstede wanted to get all the houses from the gas. And they do it together with Eneco. And for very long, they've been calculating, making project proposals like how can we make this profitable for the both of us? How can we ensure that like these houses, they don't have much money to spend, can get sort of we can get our business model without too much extra price for these houses. It didn't work. They were stuck for like months. And then they broke with like an unwritten business rule that we oddly altogether adhere to. They just were opened up the books, fully transparent to each other. And then they saw, okay, we can cross off some costs over there. We can see your margin that you make. You can see my margin that you make. And through full transparency, by working together a bit more on other aspects of the project, all of a sudden, they could get quite a proper margin for both of the parties. So sometimes you just have to break with what we see as normal business to actually make these broad wealth-focused projects reality. That is the challenge that we are up to. So in sum, actually, what we need is constructive rebels. We need people that, on the one hand, are rebellious. They break down the rules by which we play with business that are solely focused on financial capital. But they are, at the same time, so constructive because they construct the new models, the new rules based on broad wealth with which we can create an economy in which we also contribute to our generations in 2100. And we need for this entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, corporate activists, politicians. So what I ask you, from you and you in the webinar also today, is not to have hope for the future or optimism or belief that we'll reach a sustainable future. What I ask for you is courage and conviction to actually work hard for this broad wealth economy so that in the future our kids will wonder what that sustainable development was that mommy or daddy worked so hard for. Because the only development that they then know is per definition sustainable. Thank you very much.
Take a sip of water.
Thanks.
Quite impressive, Werner. Good job. So what is the type of emotion you wanted the crowd here, but also the people at home watching us, to actually feel when listening to this lecture of yours?
Well, I want to change a bit the intuition of what we see as value and valuable in society. And I think especially with the ending, sort of also the emotion that there's just so much perspective, but you just have to see it. And I think then, and that requires some rebellious thought, but I think with that, I think we see, well, great opportunities.
Talking about seeing, this morning I opened up the newspaper, and I actually saw that on average, the richest people in the Netherlands pay the least amount of taxes. So how feasible is this concept actually? Because I think there needs to be a systemic change, right?
Yeah.
So how feasible
totally.
would this actually be?
No, yeah, I think it is rather feasible if we manage to sort of create sort of this critical mass of people. And I think especially ABN AMRO, but businesses in general are uniquely positioned. Take for example like insurance companies. They themselves have to insure everything regarding climate risks and those things. So they have a big interest also in creating broad welfare for future generations, because otherwise they have to pay, because their revenue models are at risk. So I think it is for very many businesses very applicable. And I think that this can truly be sort of the entrepreneurial agenda for the coming decade.
I also heard you touch upon corporations, big companies, but what type of leadership is there actually necessary to put this concept into perspective, but also to implement it?
Well, I think you, as a leader, I think we soon have a panel session as well. I think what is very important that you sort of are capable of having difficult talks with your shareholders about this, because now we mostly focus on that financial value for them, and it's a difficult story, but at the same time, I think it's a necessary story to tell them that, like, you're not the owner of this company, and this is not the only value that we generate. We also generate value for society, and for that, I think you need to be rather courageous, but also convinced that this is the way to go for our economy.
Understandable. I would like to open up the floor. If there are any questions, please stick up your hand, and we'll get to you with a microphone. I mean, I understand that you need the right leadership. We need everyone to help accelerate this transition. But I could also imagine that there are children, youth within maybe a neighborhood with a social economic disadvantage.
Yeah.
How do we get those youngsters to also get this view on value?
Yeah, so in all honesty, if you look at the transition, we are giving them a very hard time right now. So we shouldn't ask them to be like change agents in that regard. I think it's our responsibility to sort of find it unbelievable, as you just mentioned, the inequality in terms of like taxes that we pay, but also the fact that in poorer neighborhoods, the average life expectancy is like 6 years lower than in richer neighborhoods. That should be something that should be impossible to exist in such a wealthy country as the Netherlands. It's bizarre that 40% of our households are financially vulnerable in a properly sort of wealthy country. So I think that we don't have to ask from the people that are in those difficult situations to sort of get convinced of this, because they are convinced, they feel it every single day, that they are in such a difficult situation. I think it's much more about the people on the one hand in politics, but also how we run our companies, that these are sort of the side effects of what we do in business and the what kind of policies we develop. So I think, and by quantifying that with sort of just as hard as your financial numbers, you also get much more awareness of it, because very many business people are very good at sort of sensing the value of money. And when you articulate social value, human capital, natural capital into monetary terms, then you all of a sudden see like how enormous the harm or maybe the value that is created by parties.
But how do we create the awareness? What do we need to do to create general mass awareness about this subject?
Now, I think on the one hand, it's a very good question. I think that's also, on the one hand, I think that companies can lead the way, and also regulators can lead the way, what we now see with the EU. I think that already helps. But I think then it's sort of the next step for companies that are actually integrating it, to also communicate that to the customers, to just show and be transparent of like, okay, with this product, we are responsible for this amount of maybe natural capital created or destroyed.
It sounds ambitious. It sounds ambitious, but I also have a small feeling that it will be quite difficult to, to get to this type of value perspective and to actually get into, what you're trying to reach.
Resistance is a key part of the journey.
Yeah, but I also hear a bit of activism. Is that what is necessary to get us done?
Yeah, I think in the end, and that's also like what I saw with the youth climate movement, is on the one hand, we were not too activistic as a youth climate movement, but the combination with like activists that are standing on that are, for example, demonstrating in those things, that sort of opened the door for us to actually sort of talk about these concerns from future generations. So such a sort of collaborations, I think tremendously valuable.
All right, I see that we got some questions from the audience at home. Werner, how do you yourself convince your family and friends to work on this common future of ours?
That's a good question. So one interesting thing is actually sort of the most important people to actually influence is your personal network. Like what we see actually is that climate has become, and especially like these issues, has become sort of this itchy topic that you maybe make a joke about, but then laugh away on birthdays. But the key thing is that we sort of utilize our closest social contacts to actually talk about this, because they are, I now talk about you, but you're much likely to take up something from your close friend than from me. And vice versa works the same way. So I think it's very important to end this sort of collective silence. And what I did is just like show myself how much I care, but also the emotions that you feel when you see, for example, I don't know, an IPCC report. And since this is also about your loved ones, then they also feel empathy for you, and then that starts to tick for them as well. And I think for people to actually change, it's very good to always keep in mind to sort of see, do they have like the capacity? So do they have like the time, the knowledge to do it? Do they have the motivation, so the reason for doing it? And finally, sort of the context, as in like, is it made easy to actually do it? If you have those three in touch, it's very likely that people actually start acting on it.
But how do we get people that are maybe busy with soccer or thinking of completely other things than, an impactful 2100? How do we reach those people?
Now, your question should be whether you should start with reaching those people. I think this is a growing story, and it's much stronger, I think, if it sort of lands in like boardrooms first, because those are the key decision makers on these things that actually govern the core value generation that we have in our companies and in our country. And if you do that, then it slowly sort of trickle-down economics is something we said goodbye to, but like then that will trickle down that transparency and that concept of values once companies and especially C-suite level people.
So start at a boardroom.
Yeah.
We have another question. Where should we, of all the things that you mentioned, as ABN AMRO start? Where should we begin?
Well, you already started. And I think I mapped some steps also on the slides. So I think a core thing is to actually integrate it into the business. As in, like, I think you have already some funds, which is, I think, very good that you have these impact funds and sustainable investment funds, but try to value it truly in your risk assessment. And for example, when you value a company in your valuation models, don't only look at financial capitals, but also look at the net present value of like natural capital, social capital, human capital. It will be tremendously difficult. I'm acutely aware of that. But we don't have to do it by sort of 3 numbers behind the comma. You can also start by sort of like having big estimations and already trying to steer on that. Start with ratings perhaps, and then sort of slowly get it more precise and more precise. So that's actually sort of almost like accounting.
But how do we get everyone literate?
Sorry?
How do we get everyone within the company literate that they also look from the perspective of a impact lens?
Now, I think that's sort of a very important thing. That's for any challenge or transition within a company, is that when you work on this, and you already started working on this, the people that are working on this should see it as their challenge to make it relevant for every single position in the company. So that a quant or like an IT person or a relationship manager knows exactly why this story about impact is also his or her story. And that is, I think, just a challenge that takes time, but I think to make that sort of so personal and clear for every position, that is sort of the key, so that they also start to see themselves and bring it back, so that they can bring the story further.
Understandable. Just checking if there are any questions in the room. Sure. Do we have a microphone? No, we don't. Please speak up. Yeah.
Thank you, Werner, for your story. And gladly, I recognize a lot of the things that you advise. I think a lot of people in this room are advocates of the things that you suggest, and I am also proud that as a bank we are already doing a lot. Well, no, we're doing something on a lot of the topics that you mentioned. But my question is, given the time that we have, or maybe I should rephrase it into, given the time that we don't have, how do we accelerate it? So we're taking action, but how do we do it quicker?
Yeah, so the question was to repeat it, like, given the time that we don't have, how do we accelerate it? I think there are various things. First of all, sort of bark up the right tree within the bank to sort of like what I said with the board members, but at the same time, try to create like a coalition of the willing of like also organizations. I mentioned like insurance companies within the financial sector have a enormous sort of benefit from this. If you manage to apply this by a wide diversity of companies, and you, for example, it doesn't go fast enough within ABN AMRO, then that can also exert like external pressure on ABN AMRO itself. We have now Frank Elderson from the DNB at the ECB, European Central Bank. He is one of the champions on sustainability and is getting pretty rough. So if it doesn't work within ABN AMRO to sort of accelerate, maybe step to the regulator to sort of see what kind of acceleration there is possible. We have like the Sustainable Finance Lab. I think there are already sort of growing networks in which you can sort of try to exert more forces. The key thing is, and that is also not my expertise, but the people in the bank sort of try to find sort of the right network for the right moment in the transition.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, it does. But I think all the people here know what kind of efforts we're taking on specifically these things. Yeah. And I feel still it's not going fast enough. So that's also maybe something for later to talk about in a bit more nuance. But it shows the paradox of the situation that we're in.
Yeah, I'm very interested in like what are the interests that sort of like are against each other then in this story.
We have another question. Do you have some examples how the generation assessment has worked in government decisions?
Yeah, a very nice example is that what we also realize, you have this National Growth Fund. Yeah. Of like 20 billion, I think, to invest in infrastructure projects. We managed to sort of organize there also like it's called a future council, but de facto it's such a generation test. And so for every sort of proposal that is given into that fund, they then, for example, test, just like the impact report does for ABN AMRO, they just test like, okay, what's the broad wealth? And actually they, in governments, they do it like MKBA's, societal cost and benefit analysis. And then they just test like, okay, for the long term, what kind of societal value does it create and or destroy? And that gives sort of an additional valuation aside from the financial valuation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been done, for example, for infrastructure projects. There was one of the applicants that sort of asked to sort of extend the subway line from Amsterdam to Schiphol, for example. Now, that had very little additional societal value. I think there was a tram line in Utrecht, also very little additional societal value. So in that way, you can come to a much broader picture on what actually should be valued in choosing one of those topics.
And you also have some examples how it has worked in other large corporations?
Now, the interesting thing is that this generation test is rather new, but for example, network operator Alliander, which is like middle and low networks in the Netherlands, they do sort of also this broad wealth calculating, and they just, for example, with it's a process called cable pooling. They just calculate actually like, okay, should we sort of, where should we invest our money in? And then based on some sort of future models on like how much broad wealth is it going to create and how much biodiversity do we have to destroy by, for example, opening up the ground for like the cables, for example, they come to a valuation of where they have to put their money actually.
But when you mean broad wealth, who are you referring to?
Well, you refer to sort of those 6 capitals. So you make a valuation on those 6 capitals. Financial, how much does it actually get you? Social, so for example, for that, there's not too much social capital involved. It's more like, but what kind of projects you can then realize about what kind of social capital it then realizes. And it like on the most important stakeholders. So it's the people that are actually using the network, for example. It is the employees actually working. And on that you then sort of base your broad wealth valuation.
Okay. Do we have any other questions within the audience? All right. I maybe have a last question.
Yeah.
In a perfect world.
Yeah.
In a perfect world, what can we do sitting here today to help reach that 2100 economy?
What can we do today to?
Yes.
Now, yeah, in a perfect world, then there would be, of course, no resistance. But yeah, I think that the core thing is that you can be sort of a constructive rebel that sort of like is speaking up, but at the same time also building an alternative, and that can be either in parallel or that can be sort of as a direct replacement for your current system.
So we just gotta do it.
Yeah,
basically.
and I think now maybe like for yourself, like my question that leads me also in my career is then like, am I using my time in the best way to actually accelerate this transition? And that's a question that you have to constantly ask. So if you're, for example, like torn down by all the resistance that you experience within your company, for example, it very helps me a lot to set like a 3 and a 5 year goal. And if you don't accelerate fast enough on that, then that's probably not the context in which you sort of have to work to bring this story further. So to critically evaluate whether you are sort of at the perfect position to make most value of your qualities. I think that's a very important consideration for bringing this transition further.
All right. On that note, I would also like to conclude this session for now. We would like to thank you for the time that you have taken to help us and talk us through this 2100 economy. We would like to thank you all in the audience also for listening, and those viewers at home. For now, we wish you a lovely rest of the day and hope to see you back in a bit. Thank you.